I was class of 1988. What that means is in the fall of 1984, 30 years ago, I was in the same seats that you were in for the first time, coming in as a freshman. And I came from Brooklyn Tech High School. So my first exposure to St. Francis College was, believe it or not, 30 years ago. So I know some of you here are freshmen, and I know what you're probably feeling. I remember those days very, very well. And I have to say, number one, it goes very fast, as I'm sure you've heard. But much more importantly, I think a message for all of you is, if you go to St. Francis and you work hard, you can do anything. You can come work for us at National Grid. You can work for other companies. You can come here and teach at St. Francis. You can have great jobs, great careers, and great families. And I think that's more true now even than when I went because of technology. And really what this lecture series is about is giving back a little bit. I have been truly blessed with my education at St. Francis, and it's really just an opportunity to talk to you as students, but more so as future leaders about some of the issues we're facing. Today we'll talk about energy, and in some of the other lecture series we'll talk about topics that I hope are very important to all of you. So first and foremost, really delighted to be here and really appreciate the opportunity to come back, Tom. My background, so I am a Brooklyn guy through and through. I grew up in Brooklyn. As I mentioned, went to Brooklyn Tech, and then I came here to St. Francis, also in Brooklyn. And I was actually an English major while I was in St. Francis College. And I know there's an English class that came to join us today, and you probably wonder why you're here at a business lecture. Well, guess what? Whether you're a finance student like some of you or an English student, really we need all different disciplines and all different thoughts, whether it's business or any of the other issues that face society. And I was actually very fortunate that when I left St. Francis 4 years later, I wound up getting a job with a company called the Brooklyn Union Gas Company. Now, many of you probably haven't heard of that, but I'm sure your parents have. And if not, certainly your grandparents, because Brooklyn Union goes back to the year 1895. Now, believe it or not, I'm still with that company, but now we're called National Grid. And if I reflect back to when I first joined to now, essentially I'm in the same company, but when I first joined, we had 1 million customers. We now have 20 million customers. When I first joined, we were pretty much just in Brooklyn and other boroughs here in New York City. Now we're in Long Island, we're in Albany, Syracuse, Buffalo, Boston, Rhode Island, and in the United Kingdom, we are the National Grid. As a matter of fact, that picture you see, that is Olympic Stadium in London. That was 2 years ago when London hosted the Olympics. You see the lights shining brightly. That means as the electric company, we were doing our job to keep the power on. But now we're a company that's here in the U.S. and in the United Kingdom. Another metric is back then, our financial value, our market cap, as I'm sure Professor Gabori has taught some of you, was $1 billion. Today, we're a $50 billion company, so one of the largest energy companies in the world. And I actually had a chance to work for a few years in London as the financial controller. And I do remember during that point in time just reflecting is how does a kid, from Brooklyn, an English major from St. Francis College, stay with the same company but somehow wind up in London as the financial controller of a $50 billion company? I think the answer is quite simple. I had a great foundation and a great education here at St. Francis, but as the company grew, in more ways than one, because of my education here at the college, I was able to also grow and take advantage of opportunities each time we merged, each time we expanded, each time new opportunities presented themselves. So many of you probably think that the learning happens right now while you're in college. I think the key message is the learning starts right now while you're in college, and it really continues throughout your career. After I left St. Francis, as I mentioned, I joined the company. I went back to St. John's then. I received an MBA in finance. I later received a CFA, a chartered financial analyst. Later went back to NYU and received a degree in human resources. And just recently, believe it or not, after all these years, 26 years later, just came back from a 2-month full-time program at Harvard University, where I had a wonderful opportunity to work with 50 countries, so students, business leaders from 50 countries around the world to really talk about the issues that we're facing. So I'd like to do today is just share with you one of those issues, energy. I'll give you some of my thoughts and what our company is doing, and I'll make sure that we save plenty of time for some questions, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as to what you think we should be doing going forward. Okay? Look forward to getting started. So I'll briefly give you an overview on National Grid, and then really want to focus on the issues we're facing. And it's really, how do we optimize energy usage now? And as you see on the screen, there's really 5 ways. Everyone always talks about supply, which means solar, or wind, or renewables. I would always say the answer starts with looking at the demand side. How do you get all of us customers, all of us as energy users, to use less energy? And then secondly, you move into supply. How do you create more energy infrastructure? Third is collaboration. How do you work together between governments and companies? Fourth is connectivity. So just like you all connect now with cell phones and computers and all kinds of other devices, how do energy leaders connect regions? And I'll give some examples there. And then finally, and I think the advantage you all have growing up in the technology era, is how do we take the same thing that Steve Jobs has done to the cell phone or the iPad or the music industry or the movie industry or pretty much every other industry? How do we take those same types of learnings and thinkings and apply them to the energy industry? So National Grid, as I mentioned, one of the world's largest utilities, almost 20 million customers here in the US and UK, 25,000 dedicated employees. Over 100 of those employees are actually graduates of St. Francis College. So there's a pipeline, and it goes directly from here a few blocks away to Metro Tech, where we look for students at St. Francis, quite often as interns, and then eventually full-time graduates joining the company. And that's really how I joined, as a management trainee, as I mentioned, over 26 years ago. And we use those employees to really work on many of the business issues that we're facing, and more now, many of the environmental challenges that we're facing as a company. But we're also a very local company. Even though we're not called Brooklyn Union Gas, we're still very much a Brooklyn company. As you can see, New York represents 60% of our U.S. business. And in New York alone, we have over 4 million customers. And if you look at the map, it's upstate New York, as I mentioned earlier, and also a major presence here in Brooklyn and throughout Long Island. So let's take the issues one at a time: demand, energy infrastructure, regulatory approaches, energy connectivity, as I mentioned earlier, and then finally new technologies. And if I go back one slide, we call it the energy Tri-lemma, and you probably never heard the word Tri-lemma. I think we invented it for this presentation, but it means that there's 3 problems we're trying to solve. And if you think of either yourselves or your families as customers, when you think of National Grid or your energy usage, there's really 3 things you look at from a utility, and 2 of those have always been consistent. First is affordability. When the bill comes in the mail, can you afford the cost for your gas or your electricity? Secondly is the reliability. No one ever really thinks about the utility company until the lights go out. Or on a cold morning, God forbid, when you wake up, if the furnace doesn't come on, what do? You call the utility. So really, the reliability, that 100% reliability, is the expectation. The third one, and the one that we really didn't spend as much time discussing when I first joined, but hopefully you're all discussing now with your family and your colleagues, is sustainability. How do we make energy cleaner, and how do we make the world a cleaner place for future generations? So for me, it's quite simple. I have 4 children. How do I hand off the energy world to them someday, in that we're living in a world that uses not more energy, but rather less energy? We're living in communities where the air is cleaner, and we're finding ways to use more and more renewables. So that's what we call the Tri-lemma. And what I wanted to do is just share with you some examples of what we do at National Grid and what we're doing within the industry to start to address this. But really, the answers are actually not up here with me. They're sitting out there in the audience, and that's where we really need all of you, is to help us solve some of these problems presented by the Tri-lemma. So first, I mentioned this, always start the question not asking how can I create new sources of energy, but how can I reduce the demand for energy? And we have a great program we call our energy efficiency program. And if you look at the second bullet, we have a technical term called revenue decoupling. And most people probably don't realize this, but unlike most companies you deal with, we actually make more money if you use less energy. So if you think about any other company you deal with, in general, they do better when you use more and more of their product. And that was our business model for about 100 years. And we really thought it through. We said, you know what? It puts us at odds with our customers because our customers clearly want to use less energy. It lowers their bill. Again, it cleans up their communities. Why shouldn't we, as the utility company, have that same incentive? So about 5 years ago, we went to our regulators as part of that collaboration and said, hey, let's have a similar incentive. And if you look now, the states we operate in, Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, are actually 3 of the top 7 in the United States in terms of energy efficiency, which means in our states each year, our customers are using less energy, whereas in many, many of the other states around the country, customers are still using more and more energy each year. Secondly, it moves now to energy infrastructure, and the bottom line is in order to connect all the cell phones, in order to promote the use of natural gas, we need to make investments both on the electric side and in the gas side. On the electric side, we've now invested $3 billion in our infrastructure. And if you look at the track record, we've been able to reduce the number of outages this past year by 6%. But probably the ultimate measure is storm performance. One of the realities that you're all living through is climate change is for real. When I was a student, it wasn't even a term that was debated. 5 or 10 years ago, it was debated. I think right now the simple answer is Al Gore was right. Climate change is for real. We've seen more storms in the last 3 years than we did in the prior 100 years. We've seen Hurricane Sandy, we saw Hurricane Irene, we've had an earthquake. Some of you may remember here in New York City, we've had tornadoes, we've had flooding, ice storms, this past winter, a polar vortex. We've now had everything other than the killer bees, and we understand they're coming this winter, so beware. But clearly the investment we've made has helped us respond to those storms better than in the past. And then likewise, on the gas side, a similar $3 billion investment. And here we have a very unique opportunity. Even though we would like to convert all of our customers to renewables, even though we would like to convert our system to renewables, realistically, that's probably 10, 20, 30 years into the future. So we're working hard to accelerate that. But in the meantime, we need to use the cleanest burning, what we call fossil fuels. So right now we have a very big focus on converting customers who use dirtier fuels, like heating oil, over to natural gas. This morning I had an opportunity to go out to Coney Island Hospital. Some of you may be familiar with that in Brooklyn. If you can imagine, they've been there for 100 years burning oil. Today we announced a conversion to natural gas. It will save the hospital $1 million on their energy bill, but much more importantly, it'll save that community pollution, smog, air quality, the equivalent of taking 1,000 cars off the road. So if you think about your commute, picture it with 1,000 less cars polluting the environment. That's just one conversion from oil to natural gas right here in Brooklyn. And then last, in terms of energy investments, Long Island is probably the place we focus the most on. For some reason, Long Island has a higher penetration of oil than anywhere else in our footprint. More than 50% of the customers are still using oil. So we have a program now every year to convert more and more of those customers. And here you can see a $700 million program we've now announced to convert over 33,000 more customers. And you say, well, why would we do that? What's good about it? If you look at the checklist at the bottom, it'll save customers $200 million in energy bills, because right now natural gas is roughly half the cost of oil. It'll displace 2 million barrels of oil, and at the same time, it'll create jobs. Hopefully jobs for you when you're graduating in terms of designing and architecting and working on the infrastructure that's needed on Long Island and elsewhere. Why oil or gas or electricity? In general, in our region, folks use electricity for their cooling needs. Most obvious would be the air conditioning in the summer, of course, the lights. And then most customers in our region either heat their homes with gas or oil. But in a place like Long Island, still have a very heavy penetration on oil. So the greatest benefit we feel from a society standpoint, both in the price reduction, but more so in the environmental reduction, would be the conversion to gas. And you really get two benefits. One is you're converting to a cleaner fuel. Now, in fairness, not a completely clean fuel, not a renewable, and that's the ultimate goal, but much cleaner than oil. And then secondly, invariably, the new boiler is the highest efficient. A 2014 boiler can be 85, 90, 95% efficient. Whatever we're pulling out from 30 years ago, much lower efficiency, so you get a huge uplift on the environmental benefits. But here in the Northeast, you have very unique attributes. It's very cold compared to, let's say, Florida or down south. So you have very high usage in the winter. But we're fortunate that you don't have very much coal. So most of our energy sources here are fossil fuels, natural gas and oil, not the coal source. So the air, fortunately for us, is cleaner. But to get it to that next level, be converting it from oil to natural gas. Switch. And the challenge is, if you go back to the energy trilemma, so we're trying to solve for three variables. We won't make it technical. Affordable, reliable, sustainable. Clearly, solar, wind, renewable gas, far, far more sustainable, much better for the environment. So a big check in that category, right? The challenge is on the other two legs of the stool. Take wind. Right now, wind is actually more expensive than traditional forms of electricity, so it doesn't meet the affordability criteria. And the one thing about the wind is when it's windy, it generates a lot of power. When it's not windy, it creates what's called intermittency. It doesn't create power. And I don't think any of us are willing to only have lights on windy days or sunny days. And the goal is now, as energy leaders, well, how do you fix that? How do you solve that? How do you bring the price down? So someday I can get up here and say, wind is actually economic compared to traditional sources of electricity. And oh, by the way, we figured out the intermittency thing is now on days when it's not windy, we're going to store the power from the days where it is windy, and then we're going to release it back on the days when it's not quite as windy. We don't have those answers yet. We don't have those answers. We've been at it for 100 years. The answers, like I said, is sitting out here somewhere. And that's what we're trying to figure out, is how do you lower the cost of renewables so they can compete? And we're making some good progress. In the United Kingdom, it's very windy. And we've got a number of projects where we're connecting more wind than anywhere else perhaps in the world. But it's not very sunny. Not very sunny in the UK, so we don't use as much solar. If you go to Arizona and California, you're seeing now very, very high penetration of solar because of the demographics and because of the weather pattern of that region. But you're spot on. We need to solve that problem. Natural gas should just be a transition fuel, a bridge fuel, and then in the future I should be up here talking just about renewables. And if you go back to the three variables, right? Affordable is what you're asking about. The good news is it hits the other two boxes, so it's more reliable. Instead of having a truck come and deliver the oil once in a while, or maybe break down or get stuck in the snow, the gas comes up automatically every morning, and 365 days a year you have it. So more reliable, more sustainable, we said. But is it affordable? Well, the good news now, and we've really never sold on this proposition, but if you go back now for about 5 years, natural gas has been about half the cost of oil. So every month when you get your bill, it'll be half what you were paying previously. The only cost you have is the upfront cost. If a customer is already in front of where we're doing business, where we have a main coming down the block, in general, there's no cost to the customer. We just put a pipe in and connect them. The cost is usually in converting your old boiler, and that actually can be quite expensive. It can be $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. What happens is a lot of customers' boilers are breaking down anyway. Once every 20 years, the boiler dies. And the key is when the boiler breaks down, we need to make sure that we're there and we're able to replace their old boiler with a natural gas boiler because we're going to spend that money anyway. But I think to answer your question, it really depends on how close you are to our system. But in general, if you're close to our system, we'll pay the connection cost. You just need to pay the boiler and the plumber. And quite often you would have had to pay that anyway because your old equipment was up for a refresh. The question is, do we have the infrastructure? To be honest, the answer 5 years ago was no. Why can I say yes now? We've just invested, or in the process of invested, $3 billion in electric upstate, $3 billion in gas downstate to modernize the system to make sure that we can connect more and more customers. One of the jokes in our industry is, hopefully you've all heard of Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. Folklore has it that Edison invented electricity, and Bell invented the telephone. And the joke is that if Bell came down and looked around and said, my God, what have you done to my phone with all these changes? Well, Thomas Edison would come down and take a look at the electric system and say, wow, it's pretty much the way I designed it 100 years ago. And we think he could actually come down and fix it because many of his circuits are still in use. So 100 years ago, some of our assets to this day are still being used. That's because it was built well, it was built to last. The problem was it didn't contemplate this gentleman's question. So when Edison and Tesla and Westinghouse built our system 100 years ago, they thought that we would produce power and we would send it to the customer. You know what? They were right for the first 100 years. In the New World, this gentleman might have a wind turbine in his yard and send us the power. The problem is our system wasn't built to accommodate that. It only has a one-way highway. So the investments we're making now is to make sure in the future we can accommodate two-way flow, we can accommodate wind, we can accommodate solar, we can accommodate all other forms of energy. So when oil and gas were at what's called parity, when the prices were similar, there really was no break-even point. You'd basically be doing it because of the the environmental benefits or the reliability benefits. Most customers prefer to have gas. Now we're in a very, very unique period in that at half price, we can actually get some very, very quick paybacks. Quite often in under 2 years, a customer who converts can see the savings on their former oil bill funding those upfront costs. And that then allows us to achieve that tri-lemma I keep referring back to. One of the wonderful things about the program I just came from, and even more so working for an international company, you get to see issues that different parts of the world are facing. One of the challenges that most countries have, China in particular, is given the size of their population. You can imagine they have somewhere in the range of 1.5 billion people. So you could fit 4 or 5 United Stateses in China. You know, as those people start to want to use cell phones and iPads and the same gadgets that we've been now using for quite a few years, that's going to put huge upward pressure on their energy demand. China, unlike the U.S., is not energy rich. You know, we're very fortunate that in recent years we've discovered natural gas sources that we didn't know about. We've found more domestic oil. China needs to depend on other parts of the world. So absolutely, that's a key issue that not just China is facing, but I would say all countries. The key is that we can work with places like China and encourage them to learn from the mistakes we made, frankly, 50 years ago. We were not as gentle on the environment as we should have been. We didn't know enough, I guess, in our weak defense. We know enough now, and we can't repeat those sins. So that's why, as an energy company, if our customers are using more energy, we're not doing our job. If we can get them to use less energy, we're starting to combat that problem. I think the key is that emerging countries or very, very large countries like China need to learn the same lesson. Unfortunately, we learned it the hard way. Okay, let me move on. I'll stop again for some more questions in a bit. You know, next is really companies can't do this themselves, is creating collaboration. And whether in your English class or your finance class, I know you have group projects. And the reason you have group projects is the voice of the collective is always far greater than the voice of the individual. And if we can get government leaders, if we can get industry partners to sign on to ideas, it actually makes our job a lot easier. Great example is the Clean Heat program in New York City. Our former mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, who, as you may know, was a former finance person, a former business person, came up with a program called Clean Heat, where he required buildings that were burning dirtier fuels to convert to cleaner fuels. And if you just look at this chart, we've now been able to convert 500 buildings that were polluting our environment to clean natural gas. And here's a simple fact that most people don't know. The number one source of pollution in New York City is not cars. It's by far these buildings, these big buildings. A building like St. Francis College could have been one of those, but St. Francis is very, very careful in its energy usage and tries to make sure its footprint is minimized. We've now done that 499 other times the past 3 years as part of its Clean Heat program. Okay, fourth is this issue of building energy connectivity. I'm just going to run through a few very quick examples just to show you what I mean. So first is connecting boroughs. If you can imagine, Brooklyn and Queens, even though they're adjacent, have never been connected from a natural gas standpoint in our history. So about 2 years ago, if you look at the bottom of the map, you'll see that bluish line. That's a pipeline that we started to install underneath Jamaica Bay. So if you can imagine at the end of Flatbush Avenue, some of you are familiar with the area, we went 100 feet below Jamaica Bay and took a 1 mile long natural gas pipeline and inserted it below the surface of the sea level. We actually did it twice. We put 2 lines in for both supply and redundancy purposes. And then we took the same line and we connected it about 2 or 3 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean to bring in a new source of energy now to Brooklyn and to Queens and ultimately Long Island. If you look at another example, something called the Energy Highway, believe it or not, upstate and downstate have really never been connected from an electricity standpoint. Upstate sits on a very rich source of power plants. They have an abundance of power available. Downstate has the opposite, a tremendous demand for power because of the big businesses in Manhattan, because of the high density in these Brooklyn and Queens neighborhoods, very, very high power usage. By connecting those two regions, you solve two problems. You find a home for all the supply from upstate, and you satisfy the demand downstate without building new power plants. So we've signed on for a $2 billion investment with 3 other utilities, including Con Edison, to take that power from upstate and ultimately transmit it back here downstate. So not just Brooklyn to Queens, but upstate to downstate. If you go overseas, it gets even more sophisticated with a project called BritNet. And as the name would suggest, it's a partnership between our business in Britain and a business in the Netherlands. And again, here we went under the sea with 1,000 megawatt, 260 kilometers. So if you can imagine, more than 100 miles long power line. And what it does is it allows those two countries for the first time ever to share electricity. So in a day when Britain is long, that means they have extra power, and the Netherlands is short, that means they need power. The electricity flows from Britain to the Netherlands. That same day, the same day when the situation reverses, that same line just turns itself around and the power flows back from one country to the other. It allows one another to optimize each other's usage patterns and each other's supply. And then finally, really showing you the interconnectivity of the world, we have built one of the largest LNG plants, a liquefied natural gas plant in Britain, and we needed to do so because the source in the United Kingdom is dwindling. Unlike the United States, we have more and more natural gas. The United Kingdom previously had gotten their gas from the North Sea, and over the years, they've now utilized that entire resource, such that by the year 2020, it would not have been a viable option. Well, that means they have to import all of their gas from around the world. So this terminal at the Isle of Grain in the United Kingdom allows them essentially to connect to every other region in the world. And if you think what that means, so the U.S. now has a lot of gas at a relatively low cost. If we choose, we can take that gas, put it on a boat, ship it to the United Kingdom, plug it into this terminal, and it would still be far cheaper and far more reliable than the other sources they have locally in the United Kingdom. So it really shows that not only you're connecting regions, but at one point you're connecting the entire world from an energy usage standpoint. And then fifth, and finally, and I think the key point I would make is this is where you all can make your mark. This is where you can all add value. I'm embarrassed to admit that when I took classes at St. Francis College, we didn't have computers in the classroom. We didn't have computers at home. I don't think we had computers back then. Fortunately, all of you have grown up in that environment. My son, my littlest guy when he was 2, was already on his gadgets and learning how to play computer games, as I'm sure many of you have. That's an opportunity for you. That's an advantage to think differently and to bring technology to the workplace. I'll give you a few examples of what we're doing. One we're proud of right here in Brooklyn. There's a waste treatment plant in Greenpoint. It's the largest in New York, one of the largest in the world. You may have seen that alongside the BQE. We're going to take the waste that comes out of that plant, we're going to scrub it, pull out the methane, pull out the stuff that we can use, and re-inject it into our pipeline. So by doing that, we will heat 2,500 homes. We'll take the equivalent of 3,000 cars off the road, and we'll do so without producing a single molecule of natural gas. We'll take it all from the waste that is treated at this plant. To take it another step further, we're now partnering with a lot of the schools in New York City. We're going to collect their food waste, bring that to this plant, put it through the digesters. It enriches the methane content. It will allow us to get even more and more of the gas and re-inject it into our system. An example from our business in Massachusetts, Cape Wind, going to this gentleman's question. So we will be partners in one of the largest wind projects in our region. The challenge for the person who's developing the project, it's very expensive. They need someone to buy the power. To make it viable, to make it economic, we've signed on now for a large portion, as you can see, approximately half of the project. So it allows the developer to make the investment because they know on the other end, they have someone who's going to buy that power and then distribute it to our customers in a far, far more environmentally friendly way than we do for most sources of our power. A few more examples, a smart grid pilot. Again, Massachusetts, we just picked one community, where everyone in that community will have what's called a smart meter. So we'll put a device and a special meter in their home, and that meter will now talk to our system. And our system will know when to shut their power down a bit, when to turn their power up a bit, when to conserve, how we manage and optimize our system. One of the big challenges we have is most people use power from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock during the summer when you get home and you put the air conditioner on. Most people use heat from 6 to 9 in the morning when you wake up, and again at night when you get home. If we can find a way to balance that load, it will really allow us to optimize our energy usage in our systems. And then finally, just other unique things. If you look at those white pylons, those are state-of-the-art. They look far more aesthetic, far more pleasing to the eye than big clunky poles and wires. We have design contest students like yourselves have come up with this. We're going to start to implement those throughout our territory to make it more appealing to the communities. At the same time, we're using robots. Right there you see something called Sysbot. Sysbot is a robot that was invented here in Long Island. It's a robot that we now insert into a gas pipe. While the robot is inside the pipe, he first identifies any leaks, any problems, and then while he's in there, rather than telling us about them, he goes and fixes those leaks. He's got a sister. Her name is Line Scout. She was invented in the United Kingdom. She does the same thing, but instead of going inside pipes, she goes up 100 feet, 200 feet transmission towers, which is a lot easier for her than one of our employees to go 200 feet in the air. When she gets there, she inspects the transmission line. Again, when she finds a problem, rather than scooting back down and telling us, she fixes it while she's right there. So whether it's robots, whether it's wind, whether it's renewable gas, the real key for us is to come up with innovative solutions to the problems that we've been addressing for many, many years. One of my colleagues here, Jay Lucy, who works for the company, recently joined a few years ago and spent a lot of his time thinking about these issues. And I'll give you just one amazing statistic. In Germany, which has one of the highest penetrations of what we call distributed generation or solar in the world, on one day in July used over 50% of its power came from solar. So that's stunning. In New York, we're at times at 1%. That would be a lot. 54%. The same day, just 4 hours later, that number dropped to 0. You might say, what happened? Well, the sun went in at night. And the problem is, as soon as that happens, all the traditional sources of power have to come back on. You can actually argue that's a dyssynergy in that you have both the traditional energy, but then also the renewable energy. The real solution is someday to get solar to displace the power plants, displace traditional energy. And the only way to do that is through storage. If you guys want to invent something really cool right here at St. Francis, invent a way to store electricity. We haven't been able to figure it out in 100 years. I guarantee you in the next 5 to 10 years, it will be figured out. And the reason I guarantee that is now you're seeing everyone, academics, universities, big businesses, even GE. I would not bet against General Electric. General Electric has invested billions of dollars in a facility in upstate New York. I've had the privilege of visiting it. They've got some of the best scientists, the best engineers studying this issue. We're doing a number of pilots. Some of you may have heard of Clarkson University. Again, in upstate New York, we're going to pilot with Clarkson, and we're going to build the first ever microgrid in that region. What that means is they'll have the opportunity to plug into the national grid, like they do now, or if they'd like, for the first time ever, they can unplug and they'll run their needs off of wind and solar. And instead of just doing it for the university, we're also going to attach to a hospital, to a gas station, to a bank, to a water treatment plant. And if you think of a Sandy type event or an emergency, what do you really need? You need fuel, you need food, you need hospitals, you need emergency care. So that one community is going to have the opportunity to have the national grid, or God forbid something happened to our grid, have their own local grid. And as a big part of that, there'll be a very large battery demonstration project. And we're doing it already. It's just that the science is not yet sophisticated to scale it. But guarantee you, I hope 5 years, but certainly no more than 10 years, you will see that. And once you can store electricity, the problem I outlined goes away, because you'll be able to generate it when there's lower demand, store it, and then release it or supply it when there's much higher demand. If you think of traditional competition, I would say a classic competition would be Coke and Pepsi, right? Head to head, selling the same product to the same customers, classic competition. Or, Walmart versus Target. You could shop at either place, you get similar products, similar prices, head to head competition. That would be classic competition Even now, Apple versus, whoever the latest players are in the telephone industry or the tablet industry. That would be classic competition. In our industry, that really wouldn't make sense. So we have what's called a regulatory environment. And the reason it wouldn't make sense is it costs a lot of money to put the pipes in. You saw those numbers, billions of dollars. It costs a lot of money to hang those pylons and the wires. So we have what's called a franchise right in Brooklyn, that we're the only one who could put a pipe in. And Con Edison actually is not our competitor. In many ways, there are kind of friendly partners. We have different franchise territories. Our competitors we would look at as alternate forms. So oil companies, we would say, would be a classic competitor because on Long Island, half use oil, almost half use gas. We go head to head. So it's less around competition. I think as it changes now, I think our next era is going to be much more competitive in that if someone can come up with a thermostat and put it in every one of our customers' buildings, well, they might then have access to the 20 million customers I serve. And you know what? If they do that, they deserve that access. They've solved the problem. And if that thermostat is so smart that it can manage the energy when they're there, and even more so when they're not there, good for them. They deserve that. We couldn't figure it out. They could. If someone can figure a way to store our electricity, should we have the rights to the storage? Probably not. That company deserves a share in that. So we're a traditional franchise type territory, not really a competitor like Coke and Pepsi. I think as we go forward, it's really going to be technology that disrupts our industry, just like it did the telephone industry. So years ago, folks only had one phone. It was the one in your kitchen. It hung on the wall. It had things you'd spin around. A lot of people don't even have a home phone anymore. It's all cell phones and devices. Will it go that far in our industry? I don't know. I wouldn't think so. Will it be much different than what it is today? Absolutely, yes. And that's where you'll see the competition. In some ways, we are actually somewhat similar to pharmaceutical companies. And if you're familiar with pharmaceuticals, they need to make massive investments now and then hope that 5 to 10 to 15 years later that the investment today pans out in a product, a drug usually, that helps cure some of society's problems, whether it's cancer or other issues. Energy is not quite as critical as solving medical problems, but the investments we make today will allow us to keep the lights on for 50 years in many, many cases. So one of the things we're very, very pristine about is the level of investment we make each year. You saw those numbers. We'll invest more next year. We'll invest more the year after that, and we make sure it's always increasing. I think in that way we are similar to pharmaceuticals. The difference is that we are even more regulated than a pharmaceutical company. We're very heavily regulated, and that's because of our franchise rights. So the most basic form of regulations, I don't set our prices. I have to negotiate those with the regulators on behalf of our customers, and the regulator would then ultimately decide as to where the price levels should be. Likewise, they decide whether or not we're allowed to make large acquisitions. Now, fortunately, they've given us the latitude in my career to make many, many acquisitions, hence all the name changes, hence all the new territories, in that today National Grid is probably the product of 25 or 30 legacy utilities, both here in the U.S. and as far away as the United Kingdom. Where they then start to draw a line is how far afield can we go? So can I buy a solar company? Right now, the answer would be no. Could I buy some technology that allows me to better integrate solar into our grid? I think the answer would be absolutely yes. So they draw a boundary as to where we can play, and then it's up to us to decide which acquisitions we'd like to make or not make. But I think the point you raise is a very important one. If we can't solve it ourselves, rather than trying forever, a much better approach might be to buy that capability from others who've already done it, either other industries or with smaller companies. If you think about our planning horizon, we have actually a 15-year plan. And the reason we do a 15-year plan is, my point to Dr. Gamora is we need to invest, constantly in our infrastructure. We really need to make sure that the investment we make tomorrow builds on the investment today. So at one level, we have a 15-year plan from a kind of asset infrastructure standpoint. Having said that, from a customer standpoint, from a technology standpoint, if we go beyond 18 months, now I know I'm going to be very wrong. So really we're looking at a much tighter window of probably 12 to 18 months. In New York, it's actually a very, very exciting time for energy. There's something called REV, Reforming the Energy Vision, something that, and I'll close with this at National Grid, we call Connect 21. It's how do we connect customers in the 21st century to their energy needs. Now, you might say you're 14 years into the 21st century. What's taking you guys so long? And it's really that there has not yet been the breakthrough technology. I think in the next, as I said, 5-10 years, you're going to see that breakthrough, maybe sooner. It'll be storage on the electricity side, and it will be customer technologies on both the gas and electricity side. It'll be customers doing the same thing to their energy usage that they do with their cell phones. So you might not download energy videos, you might not text your friends about energy usage, but I'm pretty sure next time I come here and give this presentation, people with their cell phones might be able to set their thermostats before they get home, have it be a certain temperature, maybe to shut down their energy, maybe able to sell the wind from their yard to the next yard. You're going to see those types of changes. I think those will be the two biggest changes. One, storage of power, and then secondly, much more control of local customers over their own energy footprint. Okay, so let me just close, going back to the upfront question. So how do you solve the energy trilemma? And we really believe it's this program we have called Connect 21. And it's really, first of all, and please remember this with your own usage, you have to lower demand. Renewables will not get there quickly enough. It will take some time. At the same time, we've got to shave demand every year through energy efficiency and through more and more focus on lowering energy usage. Second, in our business, we need to constantly fuel the infrastructure by making large investments. Third, collaboration, work as groups, just like you do in your classes. Same thing happens in the business world. Fourth, it's all about connectivity. There is a synergy. There's a synergy out there somewhere. I'll give you a simple one. In the winter, our customers use a lot of gas to heat their homes. In the summer, they use a lot of power to cool their homes. If we could find a way to use the gas to both heat the homes in the winter and cool the homes in the summer when it's sitting idle, that would balance out our load dramatically. That would lower bills. That would clean up the environment. Simple solutions by connecting regions. And then finally, and I think my key message for all of you is it's really about technology and the advantage all of you have over me. You've been doing it since the get-go with technology. Think through how you like to interact, how you like to work with your colleagues and with your friends. Bring those ideas to the classroom, bring those ideas to the companies that you ultimately work for, and I think you will help us solve the energy trilemma. So with that, thank you so much for being part of the first ever lecture series, and look forward to coming back and seeing you, hopefully down the road when you're ready to graduate and come work in the energy industry. So thanks so much.